the Apache web server. In this nugget, we're going to talk about Apache, the most popular web server on the planet. We'll look at the configuration files used by Apache and talk about the specific settings in those configuration files and what they do. Then we'll talk about Apache modules, and finally we'll delve into virtual hosting. So pull up a chair and let's get to work. Let's start out this nugget by talking about some of the important configuration files and directories relating to the Apache web server. I'm going to switch over to be the root user here, and we're going to go up to the etc apache2 directory. And in that directory is a file called httpd.conf. This is the main configuration file for the Apache web server. On some Linux systems, this file lives directly in the etc directory. On other Linux systems, it lives in the etc http directory. Okay? Doesn't matter where it lives. You have to find it on your system. But the settings that get done in the configuration file are the same from one distribution of Linux to another. They're common to all Apache web servers. Okay, and the only difference is how sort of the directories and things are organized. All right, so let's take a look at this httpd.conf file, and you'll see some of the things that it does here in SUSE Linux in particular, and in general, the kinds of settings that you can make in it. All right, so one of the things that's done in SUSE is they list all these other conf files that were in that Apache2 directory, and they tell you what those conf files are used for. We're going to skip that because I'm going to be referring to those conf files as we go through. And then one of the first things here is in this global environment section of the conf file, you set some very important directives. One of the things that you set is what user and group the Apache process should be run under. So, you don't want your Apache web server running under the root process, because then it's got too much power. Somebody could potentially hack into your system through the web server and then have root privileges on your computer. So instead, what you do is you run it with a user and group ID that doesn't have that much power. Typically, systems set up a user like www. On SUSE Linux, they call it www run. Okay, and that is the user and ID that the Apache process is run as, and that just adds a little bit more security to your system. Now, in many httpd.conf files, right under this comment where it says run this user group ID, there would actually be directives that would list out the user and the group ID. On SUSE Linux, what they've done instead is they created another conf file called uid.conf, and they just included that conf file. And basically all the include does is copy the conf file right into this particular spot, like when it's trying to process this configuration file. And the reason that SUSE Linux does that is because httpd.conf can be very long. And if you're looking for a particular directive, it can be quite cumbersome to go through this file line by line and find it. If you know the exact name of the directive, you can search for it and find it just fine. But if you're new to Apache and you're looking for a particular directive and you know what it's about, what it's supposed to set, but you don't know the exact name of it, it can be kind of a pain to find. So what they've done is they've broken up the major groups of configuration settings, and they've put each of those groups of settings into their own configuration file. So the user and group ID configuration settings are done in uid.conf. Same for server tuning. Servertuning.conf contains a lot of the information about server processes and things like that. We'll look at this configuration file in a few minutes in quite a bit of detail. Okay. And all sorts of other things get said here relating to the ports to listen on for traffic and module information and stuff like that. Okay, so this is the main configuration file for you, and that's where a lot of your settings are made. What I want to do now is just look at some of these other satellite configuration files and look at the settings that are made in those. Okay, another important file here is the default server configuration file. In this file, a bunch more important settings are made. One of those settings right at the top is the document root. This controls where the HTML documents on your system will live. So the default on SUSE Linux is /serve/www/htdocs. Okay, so this is a directory. htdocs is a directory, and in that directory will be a file called index.html. And so when somebody pulls up your web page for your particular web server, that index.html file will be the first file that they see. That's kind of like the home page or the main page for your web server. Okay, now all sorts of other things are set in here. One of the things that gets set has to do with what's called htaccess. Okay, and htaccess or .htaccess files will allow control on a directory by directory basis. We're going to talk more about htaccess later on in this nugget, so I'm going to skip it for now. Another thing that gets set in here is the user directory directive. Okay, this particular directive sets it up so that you know, like on a web server, take a university for instance, and say at like University of Washington or something, you know, they have a main page for the computer science department, like www.cs.washington.edu. Okay, and that'll bring up, you know, welcome to the computer science department, blah, blah, blah. Here's a link to faculty, here's a link to research projects, and so on. However, all the students and faculty in the computer science department also have personal home pages, okay? And the way that that works is the way that you bring those up is you specify the root, you know, web server like www.cs.washington.edu, and then you might put like a tilde followed by somebody's username, and then that should bring you to their user, that should bring you to that user's home page. Now this directive here says what directory in their home directory will be served up when somebody types that on the web server. So when someone uses the tilde followed by a user name on the web server line right in the web browser, then what this says is that, okay, I'll go to their home directory and go to their public HTML subdirectory, and then in that directory there will be an index.html page similar to the way that it was in the document root, and that's the first page that will be served up. That will be that particular user's home page on that server. Let's take a look at the server tuning.configuration file. Now, as you can guess, this configuration file has to do with system performance and the performance of your web server. And before we get into the specifics of what all of these directives are, let's take a step back and just talk a little bit about the history of Apache. So Apache was designed for Unix type systems, Unix, Linux, Solaris, and so on. Okay, and the way that Apache was designed right from the beginning is they said, if we're going to handle all of these different people requesting web pages off the server at once, the way that we're going to handle that is we're going to start one process for each of those servers. Okay, so each person is going to sort of have a dedicated server that's going to be serving them web pages. All right, so you can see the very first directive here is start servers. Start servers is set to 5. So right off the bat, as soon as we start up our Apache web server, we're actually starting up 5 processes. All right, now somebody comes to our website to get some information. One of those processors, one of those servers, is sort of dedicated to that person, and there's 4 left over, okay, what we call spare servers. Now the next directive here says the minimum number of spare servers at any one time should be 5. So the fact that somebody is on our website now getting pages and we only have 4 spare servers, what that says is that says Apache should start up another server, because we always want to have at least 5 spare ones. Why do we want 5 spare servers sitting around at any one time? Well, the reason is because even though process creation is pretty fast in Linux, it still takes some amount of time. And if you want your users to have a fast web experience, you know, a fast downloading experience off your server, one of the ways that you can help that is if you have some spare servers sitting around. So as soon as they come on your website, they're given a server. That server had already been started before they even came there, and then that server can start serving up web pages to them, and all they have to worry about is the network delay. They don't have to worry about the time to start a process up on your system. Okay, so we're always going to have at least 5 spare servers sitting around. Now say, all these people start coming to your website. There's 20 people on your website now accessing pages all at once. Well, then there's going to be 20 processes that are in use, and there's still going to be 5 spare ones. So there's going to be 25 processes related to your web server, and 20 of them are in use. Now say 15 of those people just leave, okay? They just leave the website and they close their browser. Well, now what happens is you have 5 active servers and 20 spare servers. All right. Well, the next directive says the maximum number of spare servers should be 10. So what this does is what will happen now is servers will start to get killed off until it gets down to 10. All right. So we only want between 5 and 10 spare servers on our machine. The reason we don't want too many spare servers is because each of those servers is a process, and having too many processes sitting around on your machine means you're eating up space in the process table, you're eating up main memory, eating up other system resources, and so you don't want too many of them around or you're going to degrade the performance of your system. Now, everything I just said right there in terms of all these directives and everything has been true since Apache version 1. Now we're in Apache version 2, and one of the major differences between Apache version 1 and Apache version 2 is that Apache version 2 is using what are called multi-processing modules. So you have your choice of different multi-processing modules. Basically, what happened was, Apache, like I said, was written for Unix-type operating systems, and Unix-type operating systems start processes and manage processes much better than a lot of other types of operating systems. So Apache became so popular that people with other operating systems wanted to use Apache, but Apache wasn't so efficient on those operating systems because those operating systems didn't handle processes so well, and that's the way that Apache was built. Okay, so what they've done is they've created all these different multi-processing modules so that people from other operating systems can choose one of these other kinds of modules so that Apache will run more efficiently on their processor, on their operating system. Okay, so the one multi-processing module is called the pre-fork multi-processing module, and that's the one used by default on Linux, and that's basically the same setup as Apache 1 used. Another kind of multiprocessing module is what's called a worker multiprocessing module. Now, in this multiprocessing module, the assumption is that the number of processes is not going to change. Okay, so the operating system can start 2 processes right when you start up the web server. And what they're going to do, instead of assigning one server to one process, okay, what they're going to do is assign a server to what's called a thread. And a thread, think of it as a very lightweight process. A lot of operating systems handle threads very well. They can start threads up and kill threads off very quickly. Okay, so what's going to happen in the worker multiprocessing module is that the number of threads will rise and fall, just like we saw before. The number of processes would rise and fall depending on the traffic on our system. The number of threads will rise and fall, but the number of processes will remain constant. So you can see here the kinds of directives that are in the worker multiprocessing module is minimum spare threads of 25 and maximum spare threads of 75. Okay, same idea as what we were talking about before, but now we're talking about it in terms of threads instead of in terms of processes. And if you're running Apache on some other operating system besides Linux, you might want to experiment with the worker multiprocessing module instead of the pre-fork one. And there's other multiprocessing modules available to you as well. There's a leader multiprocessing module, and there's a per child multiprocessing module, and you should just do research on that depending on which kind of operating system you have and what you're running Apache on and what kinds of traffic you have as to which multiprocessing module you should use for your particular situation. If you wanted to change the multiprocessing module that your particular Apache server uses, then over in on Suzlin, it's in the etc sysconfig apache2 file. So if we look at Apache 2 there, you'll see down here somewhere is the npm specification. So right here you would say something like pre-fork or worker or per child or whichever multiprocessing module you want it to use. You would specify in this etc sysconfig apache2 file. let's take a look again at that default server configuration file. And if I can spell it right, there we go. And the default server configuration file, in that file is where we set the document root. What we didn't talk about was the configuration of the document root. So let's talk about that now. So you can see here we're configuring the document root. We set the directory here, serve www htdocs. So the settings that are down here apply to this particular directory. And we could set different permissions for different directories on our system, okay, based on this setting here in the directory tag. All right. Now, one of the first things that gets set in here is the options qualifier. And on this system, by default, it's set to none. All right. Well, the kinds of things that you can set there are right here. You can either specify indexes, includes, follow symlinks if owner match, execute CGI, or multi-views. You can specify any combination of those, or you can use none or all to specify none of them or all of them. All of them does not include multi-views, by the way. So if you want all of them and multi-views, you would have to say all and multi-views on that options line. All right. So by saying options none, that says none of these things are going to be allowed on this system. Let's talk about what each of these things means here. Indexes, what this means is that if someone accesses a particular file or a particular directory on your system and there is no index.html file, if options indexes is set, then what will happen is you'll see a directory listing for that directory. Okay, if this is not set, you'll just get some kind of an error like, no, that's not a file on my system. Sorry, you can't access that directory. Okay, but if options indexes is set and there is no index.html file, then you'll see a directory listing for the file. And perhaps you've seen that when you've browsed the web sometime. Includes says whether server-side includes are going to be allowed from that directory. Follow symlinks says whether you are going to be allowed to follow symlinks from this directory to some other part of your file system. And, you know, for a secure web server, this should never be set to true. You should never have options follow symlinks, because if there was a symlink in there by accident, then, you know, the user that's browsing your website all of a sudden has access to other parts of your system that you never expected a web user to have access to. Okay, you just expect users that are coming through a web browser to have access to the documents in htdocs. They don't have access to your, you know, your personal files and things like that. This one will allow you to follow symlinks if the owner matches. So if you're logging into the system, if we're forcing logins, then they'll let you follow a symlink if the owner of the symlink matches the owner that's logged in. This says whether you can execute CGI scripts from the directory. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that can be set with options, and then you can also specify whether you're going to allow an override. And what that means is that what are you allowing, which directives are you allowing .htaccess files to override? So here it says allow override none. So .htaccess files will not be able to change any of these settings by default. But what I can do is I can specify options, file info, auth config, limit. I can specify these things in allow override, and then those particular directives can be overridden by a setting in a .htaccess file. .htaccess files will live in individual directories in your web space. Okay, so maybe it's in user directories, and each user might want to allow different kinds of access to their files. Well, they can do that if you allow the certain options to be overridden, then they can control it for their personal web space in a .htaccess file. If you want to learn more about .htaccess files, there's this tutorial on htaccess, and you can see it starts with an introduction and it gets down to password protection, and it shows you the kinds of settings that you should use to specify protection on different directories. So if you want to have password protection on some of your files in your web space, and globally you're allowed to do that, if allow override is not equal to none, then you will have control over what gets done in your particular directories. And this is the kinds of things you can put in a .htaccess file to force people to log into your system. Now you also have to do some other stuff. You have to set up usernames and passwords and things like that, and that's all covered in this htaccess tutorial. And if you do a search in Google for htaccess, this tutorial will come up, and that'll give you all the details on how to set that up on a per directory basis. One of the things that makes the Apache web server so awesome is that the core of Apache is actually really, really simplistic. Okay, and where Apache gets all of its functionality is from modules. And just like when we talked about kernel modules, Apache has modules that you can just sort of plug in to the server to give it extra functionality, and you don't have to recompile the whole thing. Okay, in the sysconfig directory on SUSE Linux, there's a file in there called Apache2 that we already looked at briefly. And in that Apache2 file is where the module settings are made. Okay, if we page down here, we'll see them. Okay, here is where the Apache modules are listed for this particular server. Everything else here is a comment. And they just show you some other, the default installation or a minimal installation, what kinds of modules you would add into your system. All right. Now, these modules are added into your system, and each of these modules gives you new directives that you can set. Okay, and those directives then allow you to configure that particular module. Now, the number of modules for Apache has got to be up over 500 now. I mean, there's just the number, it's just immense, the kinds of things that you can do. You can restrict access to various parts of your system. You can have various files on your system expire at a certain time, so people can't access these files after a certain time period. If you've ever seen on some particular website like the New York Times or something, where they some of their content is accessible to you and some of it's not accessible to you, and then some of it expires where you have to pay to access really old articles and things like that. Well, all of that can be controlled with Apache modules. Okay, you can restrict people by their IP address. You can restrict and say, well, this IP address or this user can only download this much information from my website in this period of time. Okay, so pretty much anything that you can imagine somebody has written an Apache module for, and you can add that module into your system. Now, to learn about Apache modules, you should go to modules.apache.org. Okay, and at modulesapache.org, you can search for various things. You can search for a module by its name, or you can search by its description. You can search for the old Apache version or the new Apache version. You can't mix and match these. If a module is written for 1.3 Apache, it's not going to work for 2.0 Apache. Okay, so so make sure you get the right module, but then you can download the modules here and then add them into your system the way that we were talking about by modifying this configuration file. You can also get some help out on the web for setting various directives for modules to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And like I said, this is the beauty of Apache, that you get to tailor it to be exactly what you want for your particular website. Something we haven't looked at yet relating to the Apache web server is the log files. And if we go over into the var log directory and go into the Apache2 subdirectory, you'll see the access logs and the error logs for your system. If you print out the access log for your system, I've only just started it and I only accessed it from my local host, but it tells you all sorts of information about the access. And you can see where the user logged on from. 127.0.0.1 is the local host. You can see the time. You can see the command that they issued, which was a get, which means they were getting information off the web server. You can see the browser that they used. You can see the files that they accessed. Okay, the Apache_pb.gif is a image on the index.html page that's there by default, and that's one of the things that was served up by the web server. Okay, the error log would keep track of things like errors on your system. Maybe files were missing and someone tried to access it, or somebody tried to access a part of the system that they weren't supposed to be accessing. Those sorts of things will show up in the error logs, and that's useful to go through those once in a while if you're managing a website, because maybe you forgot and you changed some file name, and then there's a link to it from somewhere else on the website, and everybody who's following that link is getting a 404 error because that page doesn't exist, and the error log will tell you that that's going on. I was recently browsing a website and trying to buy something, and it says, okay, click here to buy, and I click it and I get a 404 error. And so I was all ready to spend $25 for this item on the web, and I wasn't able to do it because one of their links was dead. And I don't know how long that had been dead, but that just cost them money. So you want to make sure, especially if you're running a website that's a business, that all of your links are active, and so you want to monitor things like your error logs to make sure that there are no dead links on your site. One last thing I wanted to talk about with relation to Apache is the idea of virtual hosting. Now, virtual hosting, there's two basic forms. There's name-based virtual hosts and there's IP-based virtual hosts. Name-based virtual hosts, what it's allowing you to do is to host many different domains websites on one web server. So say you're a company that's going to host people's websites for them, right? Well, if these are really low volume websites, you're not going to devote like an entire computer to each person's website. That would be very prohibitive cost-wise. Instead, what you can do is you can set up virtual hosts on your web server. And what you can do by specifying name-based virtual hosting is you can give a particular server name, you can give a document root for that server name, you can give an administrator, you can specify logs and everything. So to the outside world, when they go to www.mycompany.com, it looks like they're going to a dedicated web server for that particular company. Okay? However, when you set up virtual hosting, you can also set up another server name like myothercompany.com. It can have a different document root, different log messages, and so on. And when someone goes to myothercompany.com, it will look like, again, that they're on a dedicated web server for that particular domain name. All right? And this just gives you a way to host many different domains on one web server. Now, the thing is that these domain names have to resolve to the same IP address, namely the IP address of your web server. So you have to make sure that's set up correctly out there on the internet. But once that's done, then, like I said, you can host many different domains on one web server. Okay, the other kind of thing is IP-based virtual hosts. In this case, what you're doing is you're hosting, if those different web domains out there don't have different IP addresses, then you can still host them all on one web server. But to do that, you've got to configure IP aliasing on your machine. To do that, you need to run the ifconfig command as the root user. So the example in this document here is that we've got a domain 192.168.1.10, okay, and that's like our regular IP address for our machine. All right, and then we're going to configure the web server on this machine to also host web pages for 192.168.1.20 and 192.168.1.21. All of these IPs are assigned to the same physical network device, eth0. Okay, and so then what you can do is in the httpd.conf file, you can specify virtual host based on those IP addresses. Okay, so now notice that there is no 192.168.1.10 specified here. 192.168.1.10 is the actual IP address of the machine, and if you're running a web server on that IP address, that's going to be configured the way that we've already looked at configuring Apache. That's going to be configured with, the regular document root is going to refer to that IP address and so on. However, under each of these other IP addresses, we have to specify the specific things for those domains, namely the server name, the document root, the log messages, and so on. Okay, so these are the virtual hosts, and the other one, 192.168.1.10, is the real host. And of course, this is all, only available on a local network because the 192.168.1 addresses are only addressed locally. But this just gives you the example, shows you the example of how you can set up IP-based virtual hosting. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Apache web server. We started by looking at the various config files for Apache. The main config file is in the etc apache2 directory, and it's called httpd.conf. Now in SUSE Linux, that config file has include this, include that, include the other thing. And remember, all of those includes are including other conf files in the Apache2 directory to be added to httpd.conf when it gets read. And the reason that SUSE Linux does that is to segregate out the various configuration settings into logical groups so that new users can find configuration settings a little more easily than and then paging through this whole file line by line. Then we talked about modules for Apache, and this is where Apache gets all of its power. This is why people love Apache, because it's so flexible and it can be customized to in the particular way that you want it to be customized. And remember to poke around on modules.apache.org to find a module if you're looking for something in particular. Use the search box, search for some keywords that describe the module. If that fails, go on some user forums and ask around and say, I'm looking for a module that does this, and odds are that that module's already been written out there and it works perfectly. There is no shortage of modules for Apache. There's all sorts of things that you can do with modules, and so just let your imagination run wild. If you want to do something with your web server, chances are there's a module out there that'll help you do it. And finally, we talked about virtual hosting. And virtual hosting is a way that you can host multiple domains on your website, whether or not they have different IP addresses or not. All right, well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.